Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many persons joining us for our fifth webinar series entitled Leading from Anywhere Youth Leadership and Learning in the ODL Era. Thanks so much. For some of you, it's afternoon. For others, it's late night. It is a varied time frame out there because we have persons joining from all over the Commonwealth and beyond. As usual, we would love to know where exactly you're from. So if you would just type in the chat for us exactly which country you are currently in so that we get a sense of the range of participants who are here this morning, that would be very useful. And I also like to call the countries by name to give them presence so that, the country is represented in our webinar. So thanks again very much for being here. Dr. Lisa Tomlinson from the University of the West Indies will be co-chairing along with me. I am Schontal Moore. I am the advisor for the Virtual University for Small States of the Commonwealth at the Commonwealth of Learning. And this morning, we are going to be talking with our special guest, Dr. Gary Pluim. And it's such a joy to invite Gary here and to, hear what he will be sharing with us this morning. And I'm not going to spend much time talking about us. I want to just go in and talk a little bit about Gary, introduce him to you so that his interests and what his current work is about. So, Dr. Gary Pluim is an assistant professor of intercultural and social foundations of education at Lakehead University, Orillia. And his interest really is in the area of critical global citizenship education, youth voice, and alternative and innovative pedagogies. He received his PhD in comparative and international development education. So Gary is well versed in the area that we will be talking about this morning, the business of youth work, youth curriculum, and those kinds of issues. Gary has done quite a bit of work and he has also lived in other places outside of Canada. He has worked in the Pacific. He has done work with in East Africa and certainly in the Caribbean. And he has recently organized a global citizenship summit for Youth Voice Policy and Action. And that was hosted by Lakehead University in Orillia in February of this year. And the target of that summit was towards young people from particularly the small countries of the Commonwealth. So Gary lives in Huronia with his partner and his three kids. And I don't know if they're kids, let's say children. And he certainly enjoys activities like running, biking, cross-country skiing. And so this morning, we are going to turn over to Gary to talk to us about his presentation. And when Gary does his thing, definitely when if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. When Gary's presentation is done, we will field those questions or comments to him. And then, you can also directly speak to Gary at the end of his presentation. And we're going to make sure that the voices are represented. So this is our VUS Voices webinar series, the fifth one in our installation. And really, we're just creating a space for the small countries to talk about the ways in which they have been supported by the Commonwealth of Learning to achieve capacity building, development, and just in terms of institutional and national development. So, Gary, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantel. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to see everybody joining in on the chat, saying hello. So hello to you. Bonjour, Anine, Dumela, Abarizaleo, Bulavinaka, and greetings to you all over the world, wherever you're patching in from. I'm excited to have a conversation today about a project that we've been working on right now for many years. And it's a project entitled Youth Work across the small states of the Commonwealth. So I'm going to speak today about the development, the design, and the implementation of youth worker courses in various countries across the Commonwealth, and particularly small countries. I wanted to start though just by acknowledging the places that we're all coming from this morning, and particularly the lands that we're grateful to be living on. And because we're coming in from across the Commonwealth, just to recognize the Indigenous peoples of the Commonwealth and their commitment all over the world as original stewards of the lands that we're living on. So here in North America, we specifically acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, including the lands known to settlers in the United States of America and in Canada. For example, the land and the waters in which I live on here, and that I'm streaming in from today, are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, including the Three Fires Confederacy nations and locally the Chippewas of Lakes Huron and Lake Simcoe. We all have responsibilities and obligations to support Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, in our efforts to overcome the legacies of colonialism. And I would argue that begins with land. So today I'm going to speak about a multinational initiative that involves youth and youth work courses and how they're developed and how they're transferred between three Commonwealth regions of the world. These courses that I'm going to speak about are intended for people who work with or who want to work with youth. These are courses to train or to upskill learners to become youth workers and to earn micro-credential certificates along the way. These courses are produced and designed through international partnerships, like the one that we have with VUSSC. They're produced through experiments with transferring curriculum between nations. And so, what I'm going to talk about today is our experience in transferring and sharing curriculum between the Caribbean, the South Pacific, Eurasia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So, I'm going to start a little bit by arguing the importance of youth. And we might say, why youth? Why is there such a focus, for example, on youth? We know that youth is a target group of the Commonwealth and of VUSSC. And one quote that really resonates with me is is one that comes from the Commonwealth Secretariat back in 2016, which says that the hopes of building a world that is more prosperous, equitable, inclusive, and peaceful rest on the shoulders of young people, not least because of their sheer numbers. And indeed, there are huge numbers of youth around the world. Estimates range from 1.2 billion from the United Nations to 1.8 billion from the World Bank. Um, of young people, and this is young people aged between 15 and 25 years old. 90% of young people live in low or lower income countries. About a third of young people live in Commonwealth countries. Youth between 15 and 25 years account for about 16% of the global population. And you can see in this map, for example, how that varies around the world. So clearly, youth and young people is immense around the world, and youth work is a pressing issue for us. So, who are today's youth? Some people talk about Gen Z. We can think of youth and young people in terms of generations. We can think of some of the issues that young people are confronted with in today's world. So, the impact of the climate crisis that's affecting us differently all over the world. I was just speaking to Lisa about the high temperatures in Jamaica right now. In Canada, we've recently had an ice storm and we have forest fires in different parts of the country, rising sea levels in different parts of the world and in different island nations, right? Black Lives Matter. Youth are on the front lines of these kinds of movements all around the world. Youth unemployment is one of the most pressing issues confronting the world today. And the impact on youth on exponentially increasing virtual environment. Um, Including Instagram, social media, different kinds of social media, TikTok, Facebook, and especially the rising prominence of AI in the world. So the importance of critical digital literacy. These are just a snapshot of some of the things that are facing youth. But there's a strong argument that can be made that global issues are inherently youth issues because the global issues that we're seeing today affect youth more than any of the rest of us throughout the world. So youth as a target audience are important for many reasons and many dimensions. And this project that I've been fortunate to be part of over the last 5 to 10 years is focusing on the youth work sector. And we believe that one way of addressing these issues that affect youth is through bolstering a sector of youth work. So within the Commonwealth, many countries that have high proportions of youth are smaller countries, and small states have specific challenges related to developing a youth work sector. Small states in the Commonwealth account for 33 of the 56 Commonwealth countries in small states, and 60% of the Commonwealth population is under 30 years old. These small states across the Commonwealth have particular challenges. When I say small states, essentially I'm referring to countries with 1 to 2 million people or less. Many are characterized as small island developing nations. Many small states are post-colonial states. Many are island nations that are globally isolated. Um, Many small states are vulnerable to impacts of weather on the global climate, but they're also vulnerable to shifts in global economies. There are smaller governments, just by definition, smaller ministries, smaller public sectors. So youth work sectors, it follows, will also have smaller capacities. Right? Um, by contrast, in many small states, youth populations are large. And so, youth, because of this dialectic, this tension of having a smaller youth work sector and a larger youth population, youth often are underserved. There's a higher level of unemployment, sometimes leading to other challenges. So, developing a youth work sector and the professionalization of youth work in itself is a challenge because the sector is multifaceted um, and there are many entry points into developing youth work and the professionalization of youth work. So, for one, having a definition of what constitutes youth work, thinking about legislation and policy around youth work in a country, practice and regulations within a country, professional organizations that bolster different dimensions of youth work in a country, the qualification pathways of youth work in a country, the professionalization and the validation of education and training of youth work in the country, the supervision of practice, and then investments and remuneration of youth workers and all the dimensions along the spectrum. So we can see there are different aspects of youth work. Our work has really targeted the development of courses, so the qualifications pathways, the professionalization, and the education and training of youth work. So that's where we've seen our entry point into this complex sphere of youth work. So just to provide us with for a framework for the rest of this conversation, so thinking about youth work as all forms of rights-based youth engagement approaches that build personal awareness and support the social, political, and economic empowerment of young people through non-formal learning within a matrix of care. So this is a definition that's come from the Commonwealth Secretariat back in 2017. And you can see from just this short discussion about youth work in the youth work sector that it's extremely complex, right? In just developing or even bolstering a youth work sector. I'm not going to go through this entire diagram here, but we can see that when we think of everything from youth work ethics to youth work values, from the processes to the praxis, from the experiences of young people to frameworks, standards, remuneration, and so on, that it's extremely complex. So, as I mentioned, the theory of change that we adopted in this project was to implement and develop youth work courses. And by doing that, youth work courses could train or upskill people who are already working with youth, maybe youth themselves in many cases, people in the larger sphere of youth work, so maybe with ministries or with universities, people working with policy, and so on. So, our first venture into the development of youth work courses was back in 2018. And we looked at a program that had already been developed by the University of the West Indies, their open campus division. So UWI had a slate of youth work courses, and the thought was through a project that generated through VUSSC was to take this slate of courses and propose a transfer or a sharing of these courses for local curation at the University of the South Pacific. That could be used as micro credentials and developed into micro credentials for a large number of learners and budding youth workers in the South Pacific. So USP, through a division called USP Global, was very interested in this idea, in this project, and we developed a plan that involved preliminary stakeholder meetings in which people brought to their table their expertise, their interests, the way that the partnership could take shape between VUSSC, between Lakehead University, where I work at in Orillia, and between USP Global in the Pacific. Um, we developed a plan for workshopping these courses, so where we would actually roll up our sleeves and look at the courses developed by UWI, see how they corresponded and contrasted with what was needed in the Pacific. And from there, move to the even harder work of writing the courses. After that, looking at hiring and developing some facilitators of courses, and then moving towards the implementation of courses through an online platform, and then at the end, evaluating the courses. So as I mentioned, this was something that took shape back in 2019. So in June of 2019, we came together with about 30 key stakeholders from across the Pacific: Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and more. And we had representatives from different dimensions of the field of youth work. So, like I mentioned before, some universities, some policymakers, some NGOs, some churches, and so on. So, we looked at the courses that had been developed already by UWI. Um, we People shared stories about their experiences with youth in the Pacific. Some heart-wrenching stories about high rates of unemployment and conflict. Some heartwarming stories about the vision and the initiative of youth. Um, and we talked about what kinds of courses would be necessary to really bolster a sector of youth work in the country. So we brainstormed courses. We used yellow stickies. We used PowerPoints. People broke up into small groups, and we organized ourselves to start narrowing down courses to six types of course, six specific courses. And we framed it around this question: what are the most pressing issues facing youth in your home community? So from this, we had some really engaging stories, and we moved from these stories to the process of curriculum development. So we thought about competencies that youth workers would it would be necessary for them to have. We thought about kinds of learning experiences that we could offer through online courses. We thought about scenarios that we could provide, different kinds of case studies that we could include in these courses. And then we thought about how these learning experiences could be rolled out to stakeholders and prospective youth workers. And as I showed you at the beginning of this webinar, we ultimately developed six courses, five of which I'm showing you here. One on engaging youth in their communities, another about youth in the climate crisis, a third course on youth rights, civic engagement, and political participation, a fourth on health and well-being issues for youth, and a fifth on youth entrepreneurships. So thinking about different dimensions of youth livelihoods and careers to their own well-being and health to global issues such as the climate crisis and so on. So we ultimately developed six courses. Each course was geared to be delivered online for 6 weeks each. We had two facilitators working behind the scenes, one partner in Fiji at USP, another partner in Canada at Lakehead University. So working in collaboration to facilitate these courses, to grade assignments, and so on, and to help credentialize the work for youth. Each of these courses ran independently, so learners could take each of these courses separately, or they could take the entire suite of courses for which they would earn a certificate of participation and for individual courses and a certificate of achievement for the entire course. We ran two iterations of this 6 week series of courses. And by the end, we had over 1,000 different learners participate in these courses. They were hosted on this platform, the Open Flexible Learning Platform at USP Global. So, in tandem with other courses that they were offering, such as international aviation, ICT, functional numeracy, we had a course here around youth work that youth workers could take. So it was a really great kind of win-win between VUSSC, between USP Global, between Lakehead University, where we delve into curriculum here in my Faculty of Education, and of course also for learners and budding youth workers across the Pacific. So this was, we provided flexible learning. It was online blended. We had open educational resources. Courses were offered through the Creative Commons, and you can see the different licensing across here, and also through MOOCs. So like I mentioned, we had high numbers of students and learners that took these courses in different facets. And as I mentioned, through this process, we ran a comprehensive evaluation of the courses and garnered both quantitative and qualitative feedback. And you can see in this slide the types of things that learners were saying. So the bottom right, the bottom left, for example, this participant said the module topics overall were straightforward, realistic, and practical to the Pacific and individual quality of life. Um, Somebody else said in the bottom right, the real world issues were presented to allow for easy translation and share with youth and community members. Just above that, we noticed we had some people that found out about these courses in different parts of the world, and because of their open access, they were able to take. So someone from somewhere in Africa took this course. They said, we lack this kind of online youth work learning here in Africa. That's why I pursued this USP youth work modules. So that's foreshadowing a direction that we're taking imminently, which I'll share with you shortly. So part of our thought with these courses was to be able to take them and look for interest elsewhere across small states of the Commonwealth. And indeed, over at the Bahamas, the Bahama Technical and Vocational Institute in Nassau, there was interest in these courses as well. So likewise, we went through a similar process in 2021. This was deep during the time of COVID around the world. So everything we did at this point was virtual. So we workshopped the courses. We heard stories about young people and youth in the Bahamas. We looked at the kinds of youth initiatives that were already happening, whether it was through the government or whether it was through the Ministry of Youth and Culture. And we worked closely with BTVI to develop some courses as well. So we went through similar kinds of workshopping, so online workshopping. Like I mentioned, instead of in person, we met weekly to run some different workshops and to, again, sort of culturally curate these courses for local interest and local consumption. So we had a variety of different youth partners across the Bahamas. And eventually we developed a long list of the kinds of topics that were of interest in the Bahamas. And what was fascinating to me was that some issues are sort of globally similar, but the local contexts are can be very, very distinct, right? So you'll see on this list youth with disabilities, healthy lifestyles for youth, COVID-19 in youth, which was a very sort of immediate concern for young people at that time. Religion, spirituality in youth, good government of youth, governance of youth organizations, and so on. So in this case, what we did is we looked at the Pacific courses and the six ones that were developed in the Pacific. So this column on the left. And eventually, the column on the right were the courses that were developed at BTVI. So you can, from a quick scan, you might be able to see some similarities, but I'll point out some interesting ones that were similar. So, for example, health and well-being issues for youth was able to translate directly to supporting youth wellness in the Bahamas. Likewise, youth entrepreneurship was a course that we were able to use a lot of the material in career readiness for youth. At the same time, it's been interesting to me in this process how each local region is very much interested in working organically and looking at the stories and what's happening in each region to develop very, very distinct courses and micro credentials for youth based on the own regional issues. So as part of this project, we're really kind of interested in the possibilities of transferring curriculum. So I just spoke about the kinds of dynamics that we're seeing in this curriculum transfer. So originally, when we took courses that were developed at UE, and then they were used at the University of the South Pacific. A couple years later, these courses were shared and shown to BTVI in the Bahamas, and how people in the Bahamas reacted and responded to these courses. But through this kind of capacity building that we have with this project, we're hoping to do something similar at this day and age, now 2 or 3 or 4 years down the line, looking at the needs of youth in sub-Saharan Africa and particularly in Southern Africa. So looking at the possibility of sharing these curriculum with various partners of ours in Botswana and looking at a pilot in Botswana to share some of these courses curate them locally, and develop them for a cadre of youth workers in Botswana. So we're partnering right now with the South African Development Community, specifically the Center for Distance Education, and Dr. Mabaleti Siletso is our key partner there. And at the Botswana Open University, Dr. Cabo Diarraditsil is a specialist in youth work. And what we're hoping to do is use these courses that we've developed, which are now up to about 13 to 15 different kinds of courses, and to see and to look at their local applicability for Southern Africa. So our next stage in this work is hopefully to run a very similar process of workshopping these courses, sitting down with local stakeholders, ideally youth participants as well, to look at the cultural relevance and the applicability of this suite of courses, and to run something for young people in Botswana with the hope of moving this further across Southern Africa. So potential for connections with Namibia, also Lesotho, Eswatini, and maybe other parts of Southern Africa, either moving a little bit north or moving to some of the islands like Mauritius, for example. So we're in talks right now with our partners to develop these. And in the meantime, we're also working closely with young people who are taking these courses, or who have taken these courses, or who are youth leaders in their own respective communities that can provide us some kinds of feedback on this. So we have a quite a strong youth voice and participatory aspect of this. And throughout the past year, we've offered a global youth experience for young people from small Commonwealth countries. And we began with a virtual phase. So we had a two-part experience with a first phase running from October to December, in which we offered four online virtual experiences in which young people sat down with each other, and through a variety of experiences such as photo voice, such as participatory theater, such as the production of podcasts, young people were able to share their experiences and share them for a wider audience as well. So our fall virtual experience included these four sessions, like I mentioned, one focusing on global realities, another on youthhood and what it means to be a youth in today's world, a third session on global consciousness, to think about being critically conscious of some of the very complex issues that are happening in our world today. And then a fourth session on global action. So, how do we get to where we want to go in today's climate? So, we paired these with different guiding questions. We had micro messages from different youth in different spheres. We had large numbers of youth partaking in each of these experiences. So, for example, we had over 100 participants taking part from different countries in the world. We paired these with local young people from our own communities here in Canada. And we had some deeper discussions, which led to the selection of young people to attend an in-person summit that we hosted here in Orillia. So a couple months ago, in the month of February, we had 24 people from 12 different countries participating in an in-person summit. And we called this the Global Youth Summit for Youth Voice, Policy, and Action. And the deliberate focus was to create a forum in which young people could raise their voices and have their voices heard on global issues. So young people were carefully selected from these virtual meetings that we had through the fall. We had some funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council here in Canada for these young people to be able to attend. And sure enough, people came in one of the coldest winters that we've ever had here in Canada. At least we had record snowfalls. But we had people come in and participate in various panels. People presented on their own countries, and they've presented on a youth issue that really mattered to them through the lens of their own countries. So we had rich sessions in which everybody had a chance to present. We had open dialogue at the end. Sometimes we had really healthy debate about these issues relating to some of the things I've mentioned before, like misinformation and disinformation, housing crises that affect young people all over the world, employment and the perspective of employment for youth. So this was a really helpful conference for us to have this youth summit. And from this youth summit, we were able to provide further nuance to the intercultural dimensions of youth work. And all of these facets have really led to some really interesting analyses that we're actually performing on these courses that we're developing today. And I'm going to share with you a couple dimensions right now that we're really kind of grappling with as we look at these courses. So one is, look, we're doing a sort of a side analysis, a side research on the international transfer of education between small states of the Commonwealth. So this is in connection with this grant that I just mentioned. But we're really trying to understand um, some deeper questions. So we're trying to capture the conditions that enable and those that prevent education transfer, and which might lead to the identification of best practices. Because we know that being able to transfer in the way that we've been doing in the past can lead to some great efficiencies. As we talked about some of these challenges for small states, it can lead to helping develop capacity in some of these ministries, but also in bolstering a youth work sector, right? And from there, to be able to also recommend approaches, strategies, sessions, and activities that will contribute to the process of education transfer of youth work curriculum. Okay? But another question we're looking at within this context of education transfer and education borrowing is looking at this from a more critical perspective. So there are many reasons and that we've even seen in this work why education is not necessarily transferring or that there is resistance to packaging curriculum from one part of the world to another. So in some cases, we're seeing that some of these courses may not be that culturally relevant. Some of the examples in the case studies that we have in some courses don't make sense in other local contexts. Sometimes there's not the adequate resources in parts of the world to be able to share some of these courses. And in some cases, there's some political resistance in adopting some of the topics and some of the courses that we're running, either for particular courses or for the packages of courses themselves. And this political resistance could mean for the formal political spheres within government sectors, or sometimes it can mean even with institutions, like the politics that we see in everyday in colleges and universities. There's also a sort of a bigger backdrop that's we're acutely aware of as well, and that we know that historically that education transfer can be a form of continued colonization through cultural hegemony. So we're mindful in this project that knowledge is not neutral and that curriculums are laden with values, assumptions, and worldviews. This is a much more kind of subversive way that curriculum sharing and borrowing play out, but it's a second dimension of this project. The third thing that's on our mind is thinking about the emergence of artificial intelligence, new technologies, um, new types of media, and so on, and how that might affect the sharing of curriculum. So, the sharing of MOOCs, the ways that we see platforms like YouTube, like LinkedIn Learning, like master classes, for example, the way that they're sharing and the way that our work can be contextualized within these practices as well, but also the dangers of disinformation, of misinformation, of AI, and the benefits of AI in how we learn globally, but the threats of AI in terms of having accurate information, of ownership of information, and so on. So these are all dimensions of these projects that I've told you about that are multinational projects that are specifically focusing on small states of the curriculum. And as we're looking for our path forward. We're thinking about and planning our next steps in transferring existing courses in sub-Saharan Africa, about workshopping new courses in sub-Saharan Africa, and about our partnerships with VUSSC, with the Commonwealth of Learning, with other partners of the Commonwealth. We're developing memorandums of understanding with various institutions, and my institution here at Lakehead, for example, and about regional possibilities and the specific interests and needs across sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm going to stop there with my presentation and thank you all for your interest and attention to this. Looking forward to a conversation with this and to see where we go with this topic.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was very interesting. And I'm going to open up the floor for conversations to be directed to Gary. If you want to open your mic and go ahead and speak, that is fine. Or if you want to type your comment or question in the chat space, that is also acceptable. So while you're doing that, I am going to start off with a question to Gary, and Lisa can pop in after, no problem. And I see Nicole has a question here. Gary, I think I want to go back to the business of youth work,
Mhm.
and just to because it's a concept or a term that I think needs to be defined for persons to have a clear sense of what exactly is youth work, who are youth workers, and also how are youth workers set apart from, say, teachers or people who just do work with youth, because I'm trying to establish youth work and youth workers as a distinct profession. And, so just talk to us a little bit about that if you can. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's actually a question we've grappled with a lot in our work as well. And in some cases, we've had conversations with people in different countries who are unfamiliar with this field of youth work, because it is a distinct sphere. In Canada, we have a fairly established field of youth work, and it's particularly noticeable at our colleges and some universities that we have child and youth work programs, so you can take diplomas or degrees in these particular areas. It can be a particularly broad field in that it encapsulates a lot of dimensions of both formal and informal spheres. So your example, for example, of how that differs from teaching, we might see the teaching as and the schools. Of course, teachers work with young people and youth workers, and indeed, this kind of training would be quite useful, I think, for teachers who have the capacity to be able to take this work on. Um, but it moves beyond the formal sphere of education and the formal sphere of schooling in particular to other realms. So it could be programs run after school. It could involve programs run through churches. It could it's often programs run through community associations. For example, the YMCA, that's active in many countries. The YMCA or the YWCA, for example, that run different kinds of after-school programs. Youth work can often involve both formal and informal learning. So, for example, young people that are mentored by youth workers, as opposed to being, opposed to having a formal and explicit curriculum in those cases. Um, Youth work, we've seen in our development of youth work courses as well, that oftentimes will focus on issues that are related to youth, but there's also a need for training of youth workers in things that happen behind the scenes that we don't necessarily see. So, for example, many youth workers are working with youth organizations that have mandates, that have strategy, that have administrative and financial burdens, but those youth workers don't necessarily have that training. So some of our courses focus on how to appropriately govern a youth organization. So good governance, for example, the ethics of running a youth organization, the ethics of working with young people, how to run a budget. So it's one thing to want to be able to work with young people, but to be able to run an organization where there might be fees or funding from different agencies, we have to be able to manage that budget. So part of the courses that we're seeing involve that. Youth work has this kind of dialectic uh, dimension of global and local issues as well. So global issues about the global, pressures that are affecting young people, but also global themes like sociology. So understanding different phases of sociology would be more sort of understanding the role of the individual in society and societal forces, right, on young people, but also psychology, for example. So understanding sort of where youthhood fits in this sort of grand scheme of development. So there are lots of dimensions for youth worker and the field of youth work that would set it apart from other fields. Some people would call it an interdisciplinary field. So we're seeing lots of different fields coming into the sphere. So everything from, maybe management and business to psychology to sociology to education and curriculum development. But the center of this is the young person.
Oh, thanks a lot, Gary. I didn't realize my mic was muted.
Mhm.
Lisa, over to you.
Thanks, Gary. You mentioned the resource and political resistance in terms of, creating the courses. I just want to know if you could speak to the local or like the cultural or the local traditions and how that also comes into, how that comes into play. Because I could imagine it can be a challenge if we have a courses being formulated and the, local or tradition, traditions are not being taken into account. Did you find that was a area that you became one of the challenges as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is probably it's probably the most important sort of consideration, I think, as we're doing this kind of work, right? So on one hand, there's maybe kind of a naive assumption that you can take one kind of learning or one course or one curriculum and superimpose that in a different part of the world, and it could be taken up, right? But even probably the most obvious concern might be language, right? Or local dialects, for example. And so in many Commonwealth countries, um, we maybe English is adopted as the official language, but it's still the colonial language of which there are many local and indigenous and different languages, and of course different dialects, right? So oftentimes even the terminology, but deeper on that kind of cultural iceberg, as we might call it. There are deeper aspects to this um, understanding different cultural traditions, understanding ways of being. I mean, one of the things at the very root of this too is how we view youth and youthhood and the relationship between youth and adults and youth and children. Things like respect, things like hierarchical societies versus more sort of traditional societies, the degree to which, so for example, if we run a course on youth empowerment, right, or youth and civic rights, and political participation, we've seen that these ideas about the degree to which a young person can safely participate politically in their community is very different in different parts of the world, depending on government structures, depending on cultural norms around what a youth should do and what a youth shouldn't do. We saw this very recently at our summit, for example, where where some youth were saying, oh, yeah, in my country, for example, I was told a young person should be seen and not heard, right? And this was something, and actually, young people from different parts of the world agreed with that. They said, yes, that's what I was told as well, right? Um, so even those kinds of nuances, right? The degree to which the way we view youthhood. Um, there are also things like when we talk about civic participation or citizenship of young people, there are different ideas about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to participate locally, the connection between youth and their country in terms of festivals and special occasions within a country. There's questions about nationality and ethnicity. We've run courses around conflict, right? Dealing with conflict because that's an issue for young people all over the world, like and youth workers all over the world. You'll youth workers all over the world are in positions where young people are in conflict with each other. And that's a common theme that there's conflict, but the reasons for the conflict can be very, very different, right? They can be, groups against each other. They can be sort of fighting for different kinds of resources, but the resources are different. Youth at risk is different. When we talk about youth at risk, the kinds of risks are different in each country as well, right? Substance abuse, for example, the kinds of substances or addictions that youth are falling prey to are different in the Pacific than they are, for example, in the Caribbean as they are in Canada. Um, so those kinds of nuances are very important and very important to have these kinds of conversations. So when we have these courses that are delivered, the case studies, the examples, the facilitators are attuned to the local realities.
Yeah. Thanks. So Gary, there's a question in the chat by Nicole Franklin, and I just want to read it. She says that based on the theme, food democracy, I saw
Mm-hmm.
displayed, how much of your sessions or courses tackle agriculture and food security for small island developing states, considering what we experienced during COVID-19 and advocating some measure of self-reliance? So Nicole's question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd be curious. I don't see where you're from, Nicole, but I'd be really interested to hear where you're from. Um, I mean, you're tapping into a really huge issue, right? Self-reliance, but especially, food sovereignty, food security in different places. And this was in our summit. This was a theme that came up over and over again, and we had some really good stories about the kinds of local foods that people had in different parts of the world, but also just this increasing era of global food, like globalization and the impacts that has on food, the backdrop of global capitalism and how food and even seeds are seen as a commodity, the issues related to monoculture agriculture, agricultural production, issues related to corporatization of different foods, and different seeds and so on. So this one issue it's a massive issue, and we see this in Canada, but we see this in different parts of the world. I'm reminded of this great documentary called Darwin's Nightmare, about food, about fishing on Lake Victoria in Tanzania, and how the the production of canned fish comes from Lake Victoria and is shipped to different parts of the world. But the local communities and the fishers in these areas are starving and are very food insecure in these cases. And we see this in different parts of the world. This was this was a topic at our summit, and this has come food democracy is something that has crept up into different modules. We haven't had this as a specific course, and you can see because of the sort of plethora of topics of all the courses that we could teach, it hasn't come out as a unique course. I'd love to see this as a unique course, and we do have one of our key one of our key project facilitators, Jacob Kiri Moorland, who's a PhD candidate here at Lakehead University, has a keen scholarly interest in this area, and I know he'd be quite keen to sort of further a course in this area. But it does come up in our other courses, including the climate crisis, and even our courses on entrepreneurship. So in the Pacific, for example, when our learners had to do their own takeaway culminating activity, a number of them came back with local entrepreneurial proposals around cultivating local produce, some local farming, how that would not only contribute to their own small business, but that would contribute to the sustainability of their own nation.
Yeah, thanks. And emerging from the question and your response, Gary, I'm thinking about the business of the developing a curriculum for youth workers or even developing courses because youth, they're continually in motion, continually evolving their interests. So the minute that you have created a course for them, in another few months or years, that could become obsolete. And how is the work of the curriculum planner? How important is that? But just to develop, curriculum that will relate to youth, that will attract youth interest to to do, say, micro-credential courses or to just be informed about the topic here. How do you navigate the business of the curriculum for youth, designing courses for youth, and working with youth and keeping things relevant, but yet responsive and adaptive? That must be challenging.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really good question. It's something that we grapple with. And there are two thoughts I have about this. One is about youth and the other is about technology. So part of this, as we've gone through this project, we've had a lot of learning throughout our project. And when we talk about getting together with stakeholders, our original vision of stakeholders were seasoned people in the field of youth work, oftentimes government officials, maybe ministry officials, maybe executive directors of youth organizations, university professors, and so on. But often when we cast our net in this direction, there's an age bias that falls outside the sphere of youth. So these can be people that are older than youth, and some of our conversations, it seemed clear that were not the kinds of topics that youth would gravitate to, but there are things that other people would think, and I include myself here, I'm not a young person either, but we think that this is going to be applicable to youth, right? But youth today, it's a very dynamic, you know, um, it's a very dynamic group and it's intercultural. It's highly complex. At the outset, you spoke about my three children, and they are youth. And sometimes can't understand what they're saying because of the words that young people are using right now, certainly when they're texting, certainly across medias and so on. So as this project has developed, we've looked for ways to become a lot more participatory, and we've developed a youth participatory focus so that young people are more and more active in the development and the design of this curriculum. So we've had much more sort of responsive um, methodologies and mechanisms and activities. So, for example, this summit and the virtual sessions that we ran before invited young people to choose topics that were of interest to them and share them with their fellow youth. And share and actually part of what they did is develop podcasts. So they interviewed each other, questions that they were curious about each other, and they provided responses. So questions, examples like I gave before about housing. Some people spoke about food security in their areas. Some people spoke about sexuality, what it means to be a man or a woman, or not fitting into either category, and how that's addressed in different countries and so on. So we've been developing a much more participatory approach. We've hinged our ideals around positive youth development, which is a philosophy that focuses much more on the positive attributes of youth as opposed to the challenges or the negative aspects of youth, which sometimes is a traditional approach or is an approach that we fall into. So we think about youth at risk or youth crime or so on, important facets, but at the same time, a positive youth approach can think about youth energy in a positive light, about youth resistance in a positive way, because we do have uh, serious global challenges, and youth can there's many things youth can bring to these conversations. So that's the first part. The second part is in the development and the ongoing evolution of curriculum is not only to involve youth, but to think about the mechanisms in which the youth can be involved and the way that they can change. So we're going through a pretty monumental technological shift in our era. Many people would suggest that artificial intelligence and our current technological moment is the greatest opportunity and threat facing humanity for the foreseeable future. And education is not absolved from this. We're a big part of this as well. And that's why I mentioned as one of the things we're looking at how things like AI or the online futures might be implicated in these kinds of courses. So for one example, for example, um, up until this point, we've often seen curriculum as sort of a static curricular document that we use and we implement in various spheres. But there's the possibility of curriculum being in more of a wiki format, where curriculum changes based on the feedback of young people. It's developed and curated in real time, so that examples can change in different moments in an ongoing kind of space. Much of our curriculum already is designed in a way that gives youth options and possibilities to choose their projects or provide local examples to be able um, to engage in deeper based on the broader theme. So choosing a issue relating to the climate crisis that's significant in their own area for that particular project. And that kind of this third area is exploring the possibilities of AI, given all its problems and threats and concerns. There are opportunities, I think, in using artificial intelligence in this kind of course development that could provide areas of expediency, um, different knowledge sharing, but also staying into the current moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. You started to talk about this a bit, and I wanted to hear some more about it, because I know VUSSC, one of their mandate or mission is around gender. And
Hmm.
you did talk about the global and the local differences that exist amongst youth. And one of the things that stood out to me in terms of gender was when you talked about civic participation, because that looks different in globally. So what were some of the challenges around in terms of gender and even getting out? Because even when you show the image of Canada, you saw young women in the pictures. Yeah, did you find some of the, your needs assessments were primarily perhaps very male oriented or dominated as opposed to um, female? Because again, when we look at youth, there tend to a lot of time when we intervene on with youth, there's that conversation around males. So how were the challenges around females, if there were?
Yeah, I mean, gender is a massive intersection, right? When we speak about youth, and you could almost talk about I mean, we've talked about, especially at our summit, about how young men and young women are have very different lived experiences, right? So sometimes we think of youth as this sort of catch-all group. But yeah, men have different experiences and women have different experiences, and we can look at this in terms of and really any of these kinds of courses too that we've developed. So employment, for example. So if we look at entrepreneurship and employment, the conversations about the type of employment that men are talking about, young men are talking about, or the type of employment that young women are talking about, and the respective pressures, their respective barriers, the respective concerns, um, you can't really talk about gender without talking about violence too, like gender-based violence, and or violence that happens between different groups. So um, we know, like in many of our stakeholder meetings, about the number of young men that are involved in violence. So violence, whether it's gangs, for example, whether it's in relation to earning income, um, and it's men against men, but also the violence that's directed against women, the disproportionate violence directed against women. We have one of our participants from Guyana, for example, has often highlighted some of these specific cases. One most recently in Guyana of a drowning of a young woman in Guyana, and about the pattern that exists for young women. In Canada, we're going through a case right now in relation to ice hockey, like hockey players and a young woman. And these are youth issues. We have young Indigenous women in Canada that are have gone missing or murdered at disproportionate rates. So that issue of violence, I think, is something uh, that we can't neglect. At the same time, youth, in my experience and looking at the literature, many youth programs, many of these sort of initiatives that are open for young people to become involved with. So, including our youth summit, including our virtual experiences, including international exchange. So, for example, young people from Canada or young people from different parts of the world who go on exchange, and including the courses that we've done are much more, we have much more participation from young women. It tends to be the domain of young women today who are involved in these kinds of courses and these kinds of experiences. So young women are taking on these initiatives um, at their own, using their own time, um, uh, using their own initiative, potentially for outcomes that they see are greater for them than our young men in the world today. So I'm not sure if I've responded directly to your question, but it's opened up like some ideas about the way that youth is, it could be one of the most significant realms of of intersectionality, right, with youth is gender, and then also especially people who are gender fluid or who don't identify them on the binary, and how those experiences are different. I mean, one just to conclude with this thought is one problem with the idea of youth work and the idea of youth is that it's very hard to sort of nail down a specific idea about what is a youth. And that's both because youth can almost apply to like any part of the population. Some people talk about youthfulness as a greater category to look at as opposed to youth, because we all know that some youth don't really have the typical characteristics of youth. They're like
Old
maybe too
souls.
mature or what's that? Sorry.
Old souls.
Or they're old souls, exactly. Some people have, and some people not for their own volition, but some people live in circumstances where they're forced to grow up at very young ages. Either they're young parents, or they're child labor, in situations of child labor, or like you say, old souls, or they're and then some people are quite a bit older who are, live life, are very youthful in their approach to life, right? But at the same time, it's also such a divided group of people, because youth themselves, two youth in different parts of the world may have extremely different experiences, based on socioeconomics, based on security, based on gender, like you suggest, that really it's hard to see them as part of the same category at all.
Sounds good. All right, thanks, Dave. Gary, as we move to wrap up, I would just want to focus a little bit now on strengthening youth work and the practices around youth work. What do we need to do within the Commonwealth, to ensure that we continue to support youth work and youth and youthfulness and interest in youth work? And what role even does policy have to do with that? That's my concluding comment and question in one.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And over the years that I've been doing this work with VUSSC and with this particular project, it's something that I've grappled with, and it's a hard nut to crack. And I think you're right about policy, that there's a lot in the area of policy that can go a long way in terms of developing a policy strategy in a country, in liaison um, with different ministries, different associations to strengthen policy. Um, there are many initiatives, I think, that are able to work from the grassroots, and we've come across so many in our work in Botswana, for example, in across the Caribbean, that are doing grassroots work, where some people are just donating their time and effort to coaching sports teams, running mentorship clubs across across religious spheres. Like there's so much happening in the churches around the world, in the mosques, in the synagogues, and in the temples and other places where people are working with youth informally, non-formally, in families and communities. So that part I think is burgeoning in different ways. What lacks, I think, in these diagrams that we saw before is sort of a more coherent strategy across sectors. And of course, things like remuneration, resources to be able to provide experiences for youth. And so this project has taken the idea of poking a hole in the training of youth workers, and if there are more youth workers that are trained and qualified in different sectors, there's going to be more pressure and more need for a sector policy around youth workers, for that ongoing training to happen, for that policy work to happen. So our current focus and hope is to develop something a little bit more robust in Botswana. At the Botswana Open University, there's already a program at the university for youth workers, but we know that there are large numbers of young people who are unemployed, who don't have a particular path to be able to move on. And so having a deeper cadre of youth workers would be quite useful. So earlier I mentioned Dr. Silezzo, and I see she is part of this call. Who's expressed her enthusiasm for this program in Botswana and across Southern Africa. It's great to see you here, Maba. And but like I say, this is one small part of it to develop the courses, to develop the youth workers, but to think about the different components and the interventions with different components across different institutions of policy, of remuneration, and a framework across the society.
Thanks. Thank you.
I had one last question, Gary.
Mhm.
Um, You had mentioned stakeholders, and I know the stakeholder I'm going to mention is not the ideal stakeholder. But I was wondering, given the reality of some of the spaces that you mentioned, even in Canada, the context, I was wondering if any your stakeholder, in addition to universities, the churches, et cetera, if you have the law enforcement and how what does that look like? Because for a lot of youth globally, that is their reality, contact with law enforcement. So I was wondering, even when you talked about the gender-based violence, so I was wondering, what does that look like? Are they your stakeholders as well?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and absolutely, yeah. Um, so um, with that said, in our work, we haven't had close contact actually with the police forces. In the Bahamas, we had some connection because they were doing quite a bit of training with young people in the Bahamas at different academies. So they had run different camps and so on. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a good example of all of the different facets of society that work with youth, right, and could benefit from these kinds of programs. So, police officers, certainly, at the prisons, for example, where people are working with youth, and so having, a kind of understanding about the phase of life that is youth is something that's really useful to be able to learn about through youth worker courses, right? So, for example, if you're working at a prison and you have a 16-year-old inmate, that inmate is going to be a different kind of person probably than someone 10 years older, 10 or 20 years older. So to think about that transitionary phase, to have some sort of background experience, to think of the kinds of conditions that might have led that young person to make those decisions or to have had those actions. This is applicable to police officers as well, to think about the psychology and the neurology behind the brain development of a young person at that age and how, you know, the the formation of our brain is different as an adolescent than it is as an adult, and it's not fully developed, specifically those areas of risk taking, decision making, and so on. So no, I think it's an excellent point. The police academies, prisons, even for example, hospitals, right? Probably goes without saying, different spheres of healthcare, different spheres of social work. In Canada, we also have summer camps, which is another dimension, right? But it is a pretty broad interdisciplinary swath of workers.
Thanks. And there's one last question from Latoya. Latoya is asking, how can we link youth work to teacher training or support? How
Yeah,
can we link youth work to teacher training or support?
yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think in many of our societies and communities and countries, we experience similar problems of different disciplinary areas being siloed, right? That we have a teacher and education area and a youth work area, maybe a social work area, and they're all sort of distinct and they don't integrate and cross-examine. We or cross integrate, I should say. Um, we uh, we spoke before about, off the top, Chantel, your question about education, right? And teachers and youth workers and how there are connections, but they are distinct. But absolutely, there could be a lot for a youth worker to learn from education and about learning and development and curriculum as would a teacher and an educator to be able to learn from a youth worker, maybe about some softer skills about youth in the context of the world and so on. So it's hard to know how to answer that question without knowing the local context and the local institutions and the politics and the kind of cultures that govern those things. I know in my experience, oftentimes different kinds of conferences that bring different sectors together can be really useful. I think what you're doing here, Chantel and Lisa, with VUSSC Voices are a good way to bring different sectors together. I would expect that we have teachers out here, that we have youth workers out here, that they're social workers. And so it's a chance for people to come together from different spheres. Sometimes just the act of bringing people together and having properly facilitated conversations can do these kinds of things. And sometimes they can be a little bit more formal, like a field trip of youth workers to a school or institute, or a field trip of teachers to a youth work program or to a youth center or vice versa. Of course, this requires some resources and capacity and initiative, but but if there are ways for individuals or institutions to find those kinds of methods or means for field trips or collaborations or conferences, that's they're always useful.
Thanks a lot, Gary. There's another question here as we're wrapping up. It says, thanks, Gary, for the insightful presentation. What
Mhm.
can we do to support the youth outside formal education contexts on responsible and productive use of disruptive technologies?
Oh, it's very difficult. Yeah, of disruptive technologies. Yeah. Well, this is a long conversation, right? I mean, I just shortly before this conversation, I was trying to get my children out to school. I have two 13-year-old boys, and I'm trying to move them
Shoot
out the
'em.
door. Yeah, shoo them out the door, and they're, one of them is still on his device. Um, and I'm trying to get him to put down his device. These devices are are constructed in ways to be addicted. Media is constructed in ways to be addictive for young people, right? Everything from the shortness of the videos to the what is it called? Infinite scrolling, right? It goes from one to the next and so on, to the way that commercials and advertising is embedded within these. There's so many things. Part of this, I think, is critical digital awareness and literacy, right? For young people to be aware that, these are constructed in ways that they're young people are being manipulated by these, right? Of course, they're fascinating and addictive, and many adults have issues with them too, myself as well, right? We have to be able to have that internal self-discipline. We should, as families and communities and educators, um, teach for critical digital literacy for young people to understand that they're being manipulated, that there are algorithms behind what they're watching, so that we're all consuming different kinds of media, right? The media I consume is different than what young people are consuming. But there are big issues that are incumbent on our politicians and global governance around media. The fact that we have a small number of people controlling massive social media companies like Facebook or TikTok or X or Snapchat and so on. The way it's governed and protected in different spheres in different countries, and the way and whether they're allowed at school or not. So I know different school boards in different parts of the world are setting policies around device use and media use. And so I think those are useful directions as well. But there is a global direction and responsibility around changing the internet so that it's acceptable for children. The internet right now is not set up for children, and it is far too dangerous, and we're seeing you know, lots of problems associated with it. There's a really fascinating show on Netflix right now for those people that are able to watch Netflix called Adolescence. And it does a really nice job of capturing the conditions of young people today in a specific context, which is England. But that intersection between gender, youth, and media is really brilliantly captured in a very painful 4 episode series.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gary. We really celebrate the work that you are doing and want to encourage you to continue as you look more and publish more and speak more about, just global citizenship education, youth voice, alternative, innovative pedagogies. Thank you for joining us and sharing this morning, tonight, afternoon for some people. And as we close out, I want to say that VUSSC is committed to supporting the work that you do because youth work is important in this particular time. It will forever be important, but because of some of the issues that you have raised and with which youth contend, it's so much more imperative for us to keep youth at the forefront of what we do, and also to include the voices of the youth themselves. As you said, it has to be about a youth participatory approach when we plan for youth, when we are looking to enhance youth and to make them more responsible or better citizens. You have to have them being part of that decision-making process. And so VUSSC remains committed to that. And for persons who are represented here today, if you are wondering about how to possibly access some of those courses that Gary spoke about, even though the courses will be the next set of courses will be in Southern Africa. I'm sure persons from wherever, once you clue in, you cannot be turned back. You can be a part of that, even though the courses might be contextualized more for, the Southern African experience, it still can be of value to you. And within your own institutions, if it is that you would like to offer some of those courses, Gary shared 6 with us initially. That is something also that can be arranged through VUSSC or even, in direct contact with Gary. How can we get the courses to your institution? Gary has worked with USP, University of South Pacific, global. He has worked with BTVI in the Bahamas, Botswana Open University, University of Guyana. They've offered, the diploma in youth development. So it's not impossible for an institution to build capacity to offer those youth-related courses. It can happen through VUSSC. And the courses are openly licensed and, they can be utilized and amended wherever to the context. So VUSSC continues to work with post-secondary institutions as well as ministries to ensure that whatever is the plan for development in your country, we can work to make it happen. The next thing is that we are scheduled for VUS Voices number 5 in June. This will close out this fiscal year of conversations, and we will be looking at the next fiscal year to start all over again. But I would love to see everyone who came out today at VUS Voices 5, as we will be focusing then on the farmer field approach to sustainable agriculture and looking at the case of Dominica and how they've utilized artificial intelligence in farming to assist local farmers, particularly those who are marginalized, persons with disabilities. So we're going to have that conversation and hear from those who, in Dominica who have done that kind of work. And also, as we close out, you will be receiving an email with a link inviting you to complete a short survey, just around 8 questions, to share with us how you found the experience of today's webinar. Quite a number of persons have been putting in the chat, saying how insightful, how useful, informative the webinar has been. And so we just encourage you to quickly complete that survey and lodge your experience there. And finally, just want to say thank you so very much, Gary and Lisa, for being a part of this conversation. And particularly for what you have shared, Gary, very, very useful. I want to say a big thank you to all the stakeholders who turned out today, from Jamaica, Bahamas, Sri Lanka, Trinidad and Tobago, the Gambia, China, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Guyana, Ghana, Nigeria, Lesotho, Mauritius, Seychelles, Malawi, St. Kitts and Nevis, Canada, Botswana, Kenya. I like to call the names, because of countries, because you are representing your country by being here. And it's saying that this is a Commonwealth wide initiative. VUSSC is about the small states networking, coming together, talking and sharing our joys, our challenges, and saying how can we experience even greater development from listening and taking the lessons from what has been shared. So thanks again, everyone, and it's been a pleasure. Gary, thank you, thank you, thank you. Lisa, thanks too.
Hmm.
Okay.
Thank you, Schontal. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks everybody for coming today.
Okay, great.